Good evening and welcome, bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. My name is Riley Brockington, and I am a trustee with the Ottawa Public Library Board and City Councillor for River Ward, and I'm very happy to welcome you to tonight's important conversation. We believe it is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Anishinaabe Algonquin First Nations people. I would like to thank our partner in organizing this event, the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Climate change is the ultimate challenge of our times, and I'm very pleased that the Ottawa Public Library will once again host an important and timely author event that can help shape public discourse on a crucial matter. This is also a good reminder of the power of books to educate and to provide us with the tools to make informed decisions. Renowned climate scientist Michael E. Mann is with us tonight to discuss his new book, The New Climate War: The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. I look forward to hearing his advice on tackling this major crisis. For another well-timed book talk on the subject, join us next week on Monday, April 19th at the same time, as Seth Klein will be here to talk about his new book, A Good War: Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. And remember, you can visit the Ottawa Public Library website anytime to find out about other exciting programs, as well to access varied and excellent library resources online, anytime. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words as well. Thank you and have a great evening. Merci et bonne soirée.
Thank you, Councillor. Good evening, everyone. I am also broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to the Writers Festival's 2021 virtual season and to thank our friends at the Ottawa Public Library for their ongoing collaboration. I also want to thank you for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. Our spring season continues into June, and it's all available online, free and on demand at writersfestival.org. If you enjoy this event or any of our virtual programming, please consider making a charitable donation. Your financial support will allow us to continue to bring you the world's most interesting authors and thinkers, even as we enter year 2 of the pandemic. Tonight, we're turning our attention to the climate emergency, and I'm thrilled to introduce our host. Tzeporah Berman has been designing environmental campaigns and working on environmental policy in Canada and beyond for over 20 years. She's currently the International Program Director at Stand.Earth and the chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. She's an adjunct professor of York University's Faculty of Environmental Studies and works as a strategic advisor to a number of First Nations, environmental organizations, and philanthropic foundations on climate and energy issues. Her accolades and accomplishments on behalf of the environmental movement are far too numerous to detail tonight, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention her fantastic book, This Crazy Time: Living Our Environmental Challenge, which was featured at the festival back in 2016, I think, in those dimly remembered days when we could gather in person to celebrate great books and discuss big ideas. Here we are virtually, so please join me in a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, Tzeporah Berman.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the Ottawa Public Library and the Ottawa International Writers Festival for hosting this event. I am so excited to be hosting this event. I'm here on the unceded territories of the Klahoose First Nations on a small island in northern British Columbia. And I spent the weekend with Michael Mann's book, and I have so many questions, it could take up hours, and they're already flowing in online. As we start this discussion, you're going to have questions too. So join us by putting them in the Q&A function at the bottom of this Zoom, or if you're on Facebook Live, I'm putting them into Facebook Live, and by some magic, they'll transfer over to Michael and I. So, of course, I think Michael needs probably very little introduction to this audience, but I will say that I have been inspired by Professor Mann's resilience, his dedication, and his persistence over the last many decades on these issues. I think many people know here, of course, that he is a distinguished professor of atmospheric science and the director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State. For decades, his work has contributed to the scientific understanding of historic climate change based on the temperature record of the past 1,000 years. He's the author of more than 200 peer-reviewed and edited publications and 5 books, the most recent of which, The New Climate War, we're here to talk about today. So with no further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael Mann.
Thanks so much, Tzeporah. It's great to be here with you. I want to thank the Ottawa Public Library for hosting this event. It is an interesting time to be talking about this challenge, and I am looking forward to having this conversation with you, my friend.
Fantastic. So, I want to start this conversation with an area in the book that actually surprised me, which is about optimism. And, despite the attacks, the critics, the deniers, the doomsayers, you have steadfastly maintained that the science shows us we need to take action, and that if we do that, if we can mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. I needed to hear that after over 2 decades of this work, and I expect we all do. So tell us, the guy who brought us the hockey stick, why are you so enthusiastic these days? Where are you seeing encouragement?
Yeah, and I'm not sure enthusiasm is quite the right word to characterize my feelings, but certainly cautious optimism that we have arrived at an important moment. And as you allude to, I have been sort of working in this area now for more than a couple decades. Originally, my forays were purely scientific ones. Investigating the underlying science of climate change, but my work led me into the very center of the contentious societal political battle over climate change and what to do about it. And ultimately, I've embraced that role to play, that opportunity to play a role in, this conversation about what is arguably the greatest challenge that we face. And the optimism that I have today comes from a few places. First of all, the youth climate movement and the social movements that are playing out today in the domain of racial justice and social justice, and the intersection with fundamental issues about climate justice. I feel like we're going through a tipping point moment, and it's a good tipping point, not the bad tipping points that we fear, the climate tipping points, the collapse of the ice shelves and the ice sheets. We do worry about those bad tipping points, but we hope for tipping points of the good kind, a fundamental shift in our consciousness about this issue. And I feel like we're going through that now. And I feel like that's also intersected with a favorable shift in the political winds, certainly here in the United States, where we've seen that elections do have consequences. One election means the difference between a president who unilaterally pulled out of the Paris Agreement, making the United States the only country to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. The difference between that president and a president who has come forward with what I would argue is the boldest agenda, first 100 days agenda that we've yet seen from an American president when it comes to climate change. So we've got all these developments. We've got a favorable shift in the political winds. We have social movements that are playing out and lend themselves to a greater consciousness about the climate crisis. There is great urgency, as I like to say. There's no question about that. We're seeing the catastrophic impacts of climate change play out in real time now. There's great urgency, but there is agency. There is still an opportunity to do something before it's too late.
Let's talk about the science for a minute, because we hear a lot about how there's so many emissions already baked in, because of emissions from the past. They're already in the pipeline. What does the science say?
Yeah, so, there have been some important developments over the last 10 years or so in how we think about this problem. And it has to do in part with the fact that we can do more sophisticated experiments than we used to do. So in the old days, with the climate modeling experiments, we would treat carbon dioxide levels as if they're a simple control knob, and you just turn it up and then you let the climate respond to that. And if you do it that way, what you find out is that when you stop turning up the knob, the warming still persists for several decades. And that's because the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere are warming the ocean. That warmth is slowly penetrating down into the deep ocean. So there's this delay factor that leads to decades of additional warming, even after you stop turning the dial up. Well, we now understand that that's a flawed way of thinking about the problem, because we don't have our hands on the carbon dioxide dial. What we're doing instead is putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the climate system itself determines what happens to that carbon dioxide. And nearly half of it actually comes back out of the atmosphere. It's absorbed by plants and vegetation on land, and then an even larger amount of it by the oceans. So about half of the carbon pollution we've been putting into the atmosphere has actually been taken up. And so the experiments we now do, we treat carbon emissions as an emission. We put it into the atmosphere, we let the climate model figure out what happens to it. And when you do it that way, what you find is when you stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere, CO2 levels actually slowly start to come down, because the oceans and the terrestrial biosphere are absorbing some of that CO2 in the atmosphere, and we're no longer putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So those CO2 levels start to drop. That offsets that other factor I talked about, which would cause warming for several decades. You basically have one factor that goes up, another that comes down. They basically cancel out and you get a flat line. And so when you stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, the surface of the planet stops warming in a few years. That's the reason that we can define what we call a carbon budget. We now know that there's a certain amount of carbon that we can burn and keep surface temperatures below a given level. This whole concept of a carbon budget, how much carbon there is left to burn if we're to avoid crossing some of these dangerous limits like 1.5 degrees Celsius, which we'd really like to keep under. We now understand that we can define these budgets. And when you work out the numbers, they tell us that, again, there's urgency. We've got to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within 10 years. That's a monumental challenge. But if we can do that, we can stop the further warming of the planet. We can avoid crossing into that dangerous zone of more than 1.5 degrees. It doesn't mean some bad things aren't going to happen. We're already seeing some bad things happen, but we can avert the worst impacts.
I think one of the critical things that you just said there, which you talk a lot about it in your book when you talk about some of the false solutions, et cetera, is that is reducing overall emissions and how much we need to reduce overall emissions now to get to that point. So there's optimism there. If we get to that point, we still have a chance, which is what I notice when I do a lot of my speeches. That's what young people always say to me. Do we have a chance? Do we still have a chance? And so I think that's exciting, the optimism there. But the challenge that we're facing right now to reduce overall emissions is, of course, significant. It's not in Canada. I don't know if you know, but our national inventory report was just filed with the UN. Our emissions went up 1 million tons in 2019, not down. We've now had 7 climate plans, I think, in our history. This one's a good one in lots of ways. You talk in your book a lot about the importance of putting a price on pollution, which we now have nationally. But that in itself isn't enough. I really appreciated in your book when you were talking about needing both supply and demand side policies, that it's not one, that it's not one thing. So give us a sense, especially for people who are not climate policy geeks, like what needs to happen? What are the concrete changes that we need to do to get us there? And what are some of the things that you've seen Biden do or other countries do that you think are like, this is what starts to bend the curve?
Yeah. No, so you're right. I mean, you're touching on, the crucial, there are different crucial aspects of the problem. There's how much carbon we're burning to generate energy for transportation, et cetera. And, Canada has put in place, carbon pricing mechanisms to try to lower those emissions, but there's also the production. And the fact is that Canada is a major exporter of fossil fuels. And so just because Canadians aren't burning those fossil fuels doesn't mean that Canada isn't contributing to our overall use of and burning of fossil fuels. Similar story with Australia, one of the largest exporters of fossil fuels. And so you really do have to look at both sides of that. What are we producing? What are we consuming? And what measures do we have in place to attack the problem on both sides? And so, carbon pricing or subsidies for renewables, these are potentially very effective ways of decreasing demand, but we've also got to decrease the supply. And that's where issues like the Keystone XL pipeline and the Athabasca tar sands, as long as we continue to mine these very carbon intensive fossil fuels, and we build infrastructure to allow for the distribution and sale worldwide of those fossil fuels, we're going to continue to contribute to this problem. Where I have some optimism with the Biden administration is more than any other administration in the past, and there aren't that many to compare with, because really only under Obama did we start to see some significant climate action, and even that was somewhat limited, and there were political constraints that Obama had to deal with in a Republican Congress that refused to pass any legislation that might assist the executive actions that the administration was taking. Here, Biden has a little bit more leeway. Democrats control the Congress now, but they can't allow any of their caucus to stray. They can't lose any Democrats if they are to pass climate legislation. And if they are to do it, it's going to have to be through so-called reconciliation, and there are all sorts of limitations on what you can do there. But what I like about the Biden approach is that there is a recognition that we have to use all of the tools in the toolbox. On the demand side, on the supply side, we've got to stop providing subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. We've got to stop allowing them to drill on public lands. And so they're addressing some of these supply side issues, not green lighting the Keystone XL pipeline. Biden has said that he will end the pipeline, but also looking at providing stimulus subsidies for renewable energy, looking at frontline communities and making sure that they're not adversely impacted by any carbon pricing that we do, to make sure that what we do is just, that it's consistent with climate justice if we are going to put a price on carbon of some sort. So I think it's the broadest by far agenda that we've seen of an American president, and it comes at just in the nick of time, just when we need it. This upcoming climate summit in December, November, in Glasgow, the next major conference of the parties, COP26. This is sort of, we're late in the fourth quarter when it comes to bringing carbon emissions down fast enough to avert catastrophic warming, more than 1.5 Celsius warming. It's late in the fourth quarter. Biden's got the ball. I'm going to use an American football analogy here, but he can't fumble it. He can't afford to fumble the ball or turn it over. We've got to take it down the field.
So one of the things that I loved in the book is that you really talk about what's holding us back and what's going to try, I think the forces that are also going to try and attempt to hold Biden back from carrying that ball down the field. I mean, I have the lived experience, like many people who are watching, of over a decade of the Harper administration where we didn't move forward on climate policy. In fact, I think Harper was quoted in 2009, right after Copenhagen, saying that Kyoto was a socialist scheme just to suck money out of good people. We were the first country to pull out of Kyoto. And then the Trudeau government, Trudeau stood at Paris, hand over heart. Canada is back, which is exciting and has played an important role. I think Canada's punched above its weight in Paris and other places. Yeah. In the climate negotiations. And yet we've seen a backpedaling on the conversation around phasing out oil and gas. Yeah. We have a government that declared a climate emergency. and literally in Parliament, and literally the next day bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline to expand the tar sands that you just talked about, and certainly to expand significant fossil fuel infrastructure at a price of between 12 and $20 billion of taxpayers' money.
Right.
This year, we just saw from the ISD great reports on fossil fuel subsidies that they've done comparing various countries that, Canada's increasing our fossil fuel subsidies over $1 billion just to LNG and fracking alone, let alone buying the pipeline.
Yeah.
So often our politics are held hostage to the influence of the fossil fuel industry in a lot of insidious ways. So in your book, you talk a lot about the old climate war, denial and doubt, and the new climate war, which is more about forces of delay, the inactivists. I love that term, and you talk about trying to dampen the enthusiasm for absolute reductions.
Yeah.
So can you give us a little more sense of so what are some of the most new tactics, and how are they playing out in this delay?
Yeah, and then you put your you really, I think characterized it very nicely. It's all about delay, because for every year of delay in transitioning off fossil fuels, these polluters are making billions of dollars profit. So at this point, it's simply a matter of them slowing down the process. They know the end game. They know that we're going to, that the age of fossil fuels is coming to an end, but they're going to try to extend it as far out as they can. Most of their assets are still buried beneath the ground. There's 5 times as much carbon, as you probably know, in proven assets beneath the ground as is necessary to warm the planet beyond 2 degrees Celsius. That means the fossil fuel industry has to leave the vast majority of their assets stranded. They're going to do everything they can to monetize as much of those assets as they can. And that's what's happening right now. And so it's about delay, and it's about distraction and deflection. It's no longer so much about denial, as you alluded to. That's sort of the old climate war, was this war on the science, on the basic scientific evidence. And I found myself at the center of that war decades ago when we published the now famous hockey stick curve, and it became a target, and I became a target of the forces of inaction. Well, here's the thing. A couple decades later now, the cost of inaction is such that climate change is no longer a theoretical construct. It's no longer an abstract notion. It's something that we're witnessing on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines, in our social media feeds. It's happening. The impacts are playing out. And so the forces of inaction, they know they can't deny that climate change is happening, and they really can't deny that it's having an impact. But what they can do is try to, use any other tactics that they can come up with to try to delay meaningful action, keep us addicted to fossil fuels for as long as they can. And so that involves, of course, just old-fashioned delay, talking a good game, but meanwhile lobbying to get subsidies and new infrastructure, built. And that's what we're seeing in Canada, and we're still seeing it in the United States to an extent. It's about deflecting attention away from the needed systemic changes, policies, big policies to decarbonize our civilization. They don't want that to happen. So instead, they'd like to make it about individuals. They'd like to make you and me think that it's just about our individual behavior. And if we changed our behavior, that would solve the problem. Sure, we should do all those things that we can in our everyday lives that decrease our environmental impact, our carbon footprint. Why wouldn't we? These are things that make us feel better. They often save us money. They make us healthier. They set a good example for other people. We should do all those things, but they want the focus so thoroughly on individual action that we neglect the elephant in the room, which is policies to decarbonize our economy. And it isn't, for that reason, it isn't a coincidence that the first well-known, sort of popular carbon footprint calculator, individual carbon footprint calculator, came to us in the early 2000s via British Petroleum, because British Petroleum and the fossil fuel companies wanted us so focused on our own carbon footprint that we failed to take note of theirs. 70% of our carbon emissions from 100 polluters, 100 large polluting companies. And so we have to keep the pressure on them. We can't allow them to deflect attention entirely to individual behavior. And unfortunately, a lot of media, mainstream media outlets have really sort of bought into that framing. The New York Times has far more articles about the things that you can do to change your lifestyle, to decrease your carbon footprint, than the policies, the systemic stuff that we need. There are other tactics as well, false solutions. Oh, well, we'll just, we'll capture the carbon and sequester it somewhere. Or we will engage in geoengineering. We will interfere with the global climate system in some other way, in some other unprecedented, uncontrolled way, in the hope that we might somehow be able to offset the warming effect of carbon pollution. What could possibly go wrong? And all of these prescriptions, by the way, are laid in what we call moral hazard, which is to say, to the extent that fossil fuel companies can say, well, look, we've got a solution. 10 years from now, we'll be able to suck all that carbon back out of the atmosphere or engage in these other geoengineering schemes. So, don't worry too much about the carbon we're burning right now. And they've got people like Bill Gates who are actually making that argument for them. He's got a book that's had wider circulation than my own that came out around the same time, where he advocates such a very technocratic path forward, neglecting the fact that the limitation here isn't technology. We've got the technology to decarbonize our civilization. The problem right now is political. It's the political willpower to actually do it.
It seems to me when I was reading your book that there is always an element of truth in the false solutions, and they play on, everybody wants it to work. We want to have our cake and eat it too. I've been sitting in meetings with the oil industry here in Canada, or with government, when they explain, you see the lights go on as soon as they start talking about CCS. Oh, we could decouple production and emissions. We could actually just reduce emissions, and then we wouldn't have to stop producing. And this, we can have our cake and eat it too conversation. And so I want to.
And it's earnest, right? It's an earnest sort of response on their part, seemingly. Right?
Like and I think there's a lot of people in industry who have kind of held on to that because of that we want to find a way to justify what we're currently doing because it's easier than the change that we see that has to happen.
We don't want to think we're bad.
Right. But so let's talk a little bit more about how those false solutions are playing out in the current debate in the run up to COP with net zero. Yeah. So, I don't know, 5 years ago, if someone had told me that we were going to be having these intense conversations about net zero, where every bank, oil company, government was going to have to put forward their net zero plan, I would have done a happy dance. And yet today, the net zero conversation seems so distorted. And oil companies are coming out with their net zero plan, which actually involves increasing the production of fossil fuels. And so it's kind of, what you were saying about CCS playing out in real time in the real politics in the run up to COP26.
Yeah, there's a lot of very clever manipulation of language that we have to look out for here. And the forces of inaction are very clever. They have focus groups and polling. They know what language is effective. They've been studying it for decades. They're miles ahead of us. They've hired some of the top advertising executives, some of the top minds in the world of marketing have been working on their behalf for decades. So they're very good at manipulating language and getting well-meaning people to buy into their framing without realizing that they're doing their bidding, they're doing their agenda by adopting that preferred language. Clean energy rather than renewable energy. Look out for that distinction, because wrapped up in clean energy is a potentially very large role for nuclear. that is lumped into clean in the parlance that we encounter these days. And I think there's some, I don't think it's a mystery to our listeners, our viewers, that there are a lot of risks that come with nuclear energy. It's a risky strategy. If we downplay the role that renewable energy and efficiency and all these safe measures that experts tell us can get us to where we need to go, you take Bill Gates, and he downplays the role that renewable energy can play. And he does so by neglecting work by, folks like Mark Jacobson of Stanford, folks at Berkeley have shown a path forward where we can get there through renewables. But, people like Gates, they don't accept that. They downplay the role of renewables, and that forces them then to find a riskier path towards, climate mitigation, which involves nuclear or geoengineering. And so clean energy rather than renewable energy, well, that shift in language is to allow for a larger role for nuclear. And we should be aware of that's why the language is being framed that way. Net zero, net zero is a very clever way of saying, well, we can continue to put carbon into the atmosphere if we can take it out just as fast or even faster. Now, we know how to put carbon into the atmosphere really well. We're really good at doing that. We have proven technology for doing that. It's called fossil fuels. What we don't have is proven technology at that scale for taking it out of the atmosphere. And so it becomes a leap of faith to believe that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere as fast as we're putting it in, because that is what some of these strategies for net zero, as you're alluding to, that's how they get away with it. Well, we'll continue to emit carbon, but we're going to take it up through carbon capture and sequestration or direct air capture. We'll suck it back out of the atmosphere. That's easy enough to do. No, it isn't. It's really hard to do, really expensive to do.
Right. And the expensive is the key point here in a lot of ways, because that's the element of truth. We can actually do direct air capture. It's kind of cool. I've been to the Squamish plant just here in British Columbia. We can do some carbon capture and storage, though it is dangerous in terms of the release of it. But sure, it's happening.
It's not 100% efficient either. Yeah.
But the scale that's being proposed in a lot of these country and company net zero plans, like, look, let's take land capture for a minute. We had a lot of questions online, I noticed, about BECCS. What is BECCS? And capturing carbon dioxide removal through nature-based solutions. We hear a lot about that these days. And protecting old growth forests or planting more forests, great, seems like a good idea. But when I first found out that what was being modeled in the IPCC reports for BECCS was an area twice the size of India planted with straw every year, and then cut down, and then we burn it, and then we capture it.
It's really easy to do in a model.
Well, that's what I learned from your book. I didn't realize when I heard about those models that we're not doing it right now.
Yeah. I mean, none of these things, as you are saying, have been done at the scale that they would have to be done to make a serious dent. And, Beck's isn't just a tasty German beer anymore. It's biofuels capture and bioenergy capture. And I forget now what it stands for, but you get energy out of it, and you grab the carbon and you bury it. So it seems like you're getting something for free. You're generating energy. And not only aren't you generating carbon pollution, if it's organic material and you get all of the carbon, you capture all of it and you bury it, you're actually getting net carbon burial while generating energy. It sounds too good to be true. Theoretically, it isn't, but practically, it probably is.
Right. And so then these strategies are being used to justify the continued expansion of fossil fuels. And what I find amazing about the whole fossil fuel conversation, which you explored in your book a little bit, is that the fossil fuel industry has made themselves invisible in it. Like 80% of our emissions are from oil, gas, and coal. It's 3 products. And yet you don't even find the words oil, gas, or coal in the entire Paris Agreement. I know, I sat there and searched for them, and I was shocked to see that you couldn't actually. So it's like they've made themselves invisible and their products invisible in the debate. But I want to get to before
they don't have a carbon footprint. It's just you and me. That's what they want us to think. Yeah.
So I want to move to some audience questions soon, but there's a kind of a tension in some of this conversation, and I think you got to it a little bit around the Brown Summit, and we've talked a little bit around Trudeau.
Yeah.
So the fossil fuel industry tries to exploit any division in the movement to make us weaker.
Yeah.
And you talked about the Brown Summit, and Brown has been an incredible advocate for climate action, put in place a lot of great policies in California, yet he was criticized at the summit because he had been approving new oil and gas, new fracking, new oil drilling. Trudeau has as well. And you talked about the need to address both demand and supply. But then also talked about how we need to make sure we're giving political space to those who are moving forward. I struggle with that because we're also should be watchdogs as a movement.
Absolutely.
And I think the supply side work and the need to constrain lock-in, both infrastructure lock-in of fossil fuels, but also political lock-in. This is a relatively new conversation in the climate policy world.
Yeah, and I confess to buying into a little bit of realpolitik there, which is to say, when you have somebody like Jerry Brown, who really, on the whole has been a real climate hero. I mean, he sort of kept us going during the Trump years where California was still leading the way. It was decreasing our carbon emissions. It was negotiating directly with China when the US government wouldn't. And so you can criticize, and there's room for criticizing the fact that, he was allowing for continued natural gas pipelines in California. You can criticize him for that. What I was taken aback by was him being turned into a villain. Like, no, the villains are the Rex Tillersons and the Donald Trumps. There is the danger of the good, being the perfect being the enemy of the good, and recognizing, that someone like Jerry Brown does operate within constraints. Yes, he's a governor, and yes, there's a Democratic supermajority, but he's just a state governor. He still lives in a country that has federal laws and federal policies that he can't get around. So yeah, in the case of Jerry Brown, I do see him as being sort of, a hero in the climate movement, and to see him portrayed as a villain was difficult for me, because then what I worry about is if somebody like Jerry Brown, if he's getting negative reinforcement for what he's doing, what's the signal that sends to other politicians who they know they're going to get it from the fossil fuel industry,
Yeah. We struggle with this in Canada, right? I mean, I certainly struggled with it during the last election. And I do think it comes down to, to a certain extent, tone. I've said myself, I support Trudeau's carbon price and a lot of what's in the climate plan. And it's not okay that we're continuing to expand oil and gas. In Canada, it's the fastest growing source of emissions from production alone. Yeah. And it's the largest source of our emissions now, just the production emissions, the 20% of the barrel that is burned here in the country. So okay, so let's segue into another bit of another sticky issue, which is related around the Green New Deal. So because I think there is a lot of the movement, the youth movement and the climate movement now that is really connected to the front lines of the fossil fuel fight. The people who are the Indigenous leaders standing up in front of new pipelines, new drilling, et cetera, are also really critical of market systems, of capitalism as a way to solve this. And you've been critical of some aspects of the Green New Deal and Naomi Klein for including some complex social policies within the Green New Deal that might slow down climate policy progress. Yet you're also talking about systems change. So can you give us a little more on your thinking about that?
Yeah, thanks. Because it's really a nuanced conversation, and which is difficult to have in today's inflammatory atmosphere, social media, where things quickly spin out of control and people get into social media wars. And sometimes it's difficult to have these nuanced conversations about things like, the duality of working within the system and changing the system, for example. And so with, it's pretty obvious, I think, that Naomi Klein and others who are, who are very pessimistic about the possibility of achieving environmental sustainability in the context of an extractive market economy, global market economy. I understand where they're coming from. I myself am not convinced that a resource extraction-based global market economy is consistent with a sustainable planet. So we have to have a conversation, and the pandemic has, I think, opened our eyes to just how unsustainable our world potentially is as we degrade natural systems, as we, a microscopic virus has turned our world upside down. We feel that vulnerability. We now, I think, feel that vulnerability in a way that perhaps we didn't before. And that's an opportunity to have that larger conversation about our values and what sort of system we want. That having been said, we've got to bring our carbon emissions down by a factor 2 within 10 years to avert a catastrophic 1.5 Celsius, 3 degree Fahrenheit warming. So my feeling is we've got to use the tools that are available to us now in the system that exists to attack this problem, even as we try to change that system for the better. And so both can exist at the same time, but that's a nuanced argument. And in this very binary, public discourse that we have today, where things often get simplified and issues get balkanized and polarized, it's difficult to sometimes maintain that dual view of how we go about addressing a problem like this one.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking at our clock, and I'm going to just turn to some of the questions that we've got. I want to keep talking to you about this.
Well, and I will keep my answers a little shorter because I know we're
got a great question online on Twitter from Rafi, who my kids grew up to listening to his music. Hi, Rafi. Can you ask Michael if biosequestration of carbon via healthy soils is a key strategy in the drawdown of atmospheric carbon? And why don't we hear more about that?
Yeah, I love Rafi's music too. It's great to get a question from him. Enjoy following him on Twitter. So yeah, that's part of the solution. As I said before, this is a problem where we need all of the tools in the toolbox, all of the real tools that we have. And to an extent, there is something to be said for the idea of net zero, which is we've got to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, and we do want to take it out. And as you alluded to before, there are natural ways to do that that aren't, messing with the Earth system in an unprecedented way, in a dangerous way. So I get nervous about sort of the geoengineering and artificial approaches and all of the potential problems that come with that. But I think there is a role for natural carbon burial through reforestation, afforestation, and certainly let's stop deforestation at the very least, and regenerative agriculture and other means of carbon burial, land use policies, agricultural policies that help us sequester carbon. All of that has to be on the table. Again, I'm not a shill for the Biden administration, but I will give them some kudos for recognizing that. And they do address policies regarding agriculture and land use. They recognize that that's going to be an important part of the solution. We've got to stop putting carbon into the atmosphere, and we've got to do what we can in a safe way to take it back out.
Related question online about, are trees still the most effective technology for carbon capture?
Well, nature is pretty clever. You give it millions and billions of years, and it can solve all sorts of problems. And so trees are really effective absorbers of carbon. Now, the problem is they do die, and the organic matter, some of it, decays, makes it back up into the atmosphere. And certainly if it's burned, if it's oxidized, it makes it back into the atmosphere. So there is this idea that, well, maybe we can improve on trees. What we'll do is we will speed up the process. They use photosynthesis. We can come up with synthetic processes that work a lot faster than photosynthesis. They take CO2 out more efficiently. And unlike a tree, which leaves organic refuse around that can decay and make it back into the atmosphere, we'll take that carbon and we'll bury it deep. And that sort of underlies a lot of the direct air capture schemes that we read about. So of all of the geoengineering schemes that are out there, I do think that direct air capture is something that we probably do want to look at, but it's got to be done efficiently. We can't be, if it takes as much energy to manufacture and deploy this stuff as, as it offsets from a fossil fuel burning standpoint, then it's not helping us. And so we've got to be sure that if you look at a full life cycle analysis, that it really is helping us in our efforts to bury carbon. And I know folks like Mark Jacobson are skeptical. He's argued that if we put resources even into direct air capture, what we're doing is we're actually taking resources away that could have been put into renewable energy that doesn't generate any carbon pollution. And so it's a net loss. I'm a bit, I guess I'm still, open-minded about it. I think we should continue to investigate that possibility, but we can't bank on it, and we can't allow it to be used as a crutch for polluters to say, okay, so we can still pollute now because we'll do direct air capture 10 years from now.
Right. A lot of questions online about LNG. In Canada, LNG is being promoted as a global climate solution, both by our Prime Minister and certainly here in this province, where the largest, one of the largest LNG facilities in the world is currently planned to be built here, LNG Canada, with huge subsidies from the government. So can you talk about LNG as a solution to the climate problem?
Yep, and I promised some short answers here. So here's a short one. The solution to a problem created by fossil fuels cannot be a fossil fuel, LNG or anything else.
Well, you're right. That was a very short answer to a very intense problem, but it does make you feel like you're getting out of the.
I think it really is that simple.
Fire.
I think it is that simple. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the fact that it's already we're starting to see that it's actually displacing renewables. It's exactly. As you note in your book, no longer a bridge if it ever was. Okay, a bunch of questions about you and resiliency from Jackie Mercer online. You're famous for your hockey stick graph, which really drove home for a lot of people the real impact that humans were having on the climate. How did that research and publication impact your career? And tell us a bit about the notoriety that came along with that. And then previously on Twitter, I got a question. Is there something in your history that galvanized you to up your game and to be able to speak like this? What was the personal experience that made you become more serious about becoming such a vocal force for good?
Well, thanks for the questions. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when I double majored in applied math and physics as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley, I didn't think I was setting myself up for a career at the center of the most contentious political debate we've ever had on this planet. But that is where my work led me because of the hockey stick. It became sort of this iconic symbol in the climate change debate, and it thrust me into the center of the public arena. And as the second question sort of gets at, I recognized that I had an opportunity and I better not squander it. Whether I liked it or not, I had been thrust into the center of this fractious debate, and it's not what I had signed up for. I love doing science. I love solving, problems, writing computer code to do calculations. This was the sort of stuff that I geeked out on in high school. And that's what I thought I was going to do. And that's what got me into science. But when, my science took on this larger dimension, I realized that I had an opportunity potentially to do something different, to do something greater. That I had an opportunity to inform this conversation about, what is arguably the greatest challenge that we faced as a civilization. That is a great privilege, I didn't want to squander that privilege. And I realized that to make the most of it, I had to be effective at what I was doing. I understood that you have to be effective as a scientist to make it a career in science, but you've got to be effective as a communicator if you're going to try to make a career in communicating science to the public. And I had role models to watch that I had looked up to when I was younger, never realizing that they might actually be literal role models for what I myself might want to or have to do. And they were folks, like
you talked about Carl Sagan a lot in the beginning of the book.
Carl Sagan, but you've got Jane Goodall, you've got these public figures in science who are great scientists, but they also recognize that there was an opportunity to do something greater, to do something that really speaks to the great challenges that we face. I had that opportunity. I didn't want to squander it. And so, I worked at being as good as I can be at doing it. And it's, and I appreciate the kind comments from the questioner, but it's an opportunity. I don't want to squander it because the stakes couldn't be greater. We're literally talking about the future of our planet.
There were a number of questions about the attacks on you, the personal attacks, and that I remember reading in the book, you said Patrick Moore called you a death wish cultist. There was a moment of kin for me because I was once on national news. Patrick Moore called me a whacked out nature worshiper who prays to the moon.
He needs to sit down. He needs to drink a glass of Roundup and just calm down.
Oh, that's right. That moment when he talked about how safe it was and then refused to drink it. That was a great
brilliant
story
brilliant.
In your book. But so you've faced these attacks, yet you stay calm and positive despite it all. So the question is, how do you do this?
Well, the attacks are so frequent, I barely notice them anymore, really. It's a line from, I believe it's the Blues Brothers. But no, how often do the trains come around? So often you barely even notice it. And sometimes it feels that way. You do, it sort of just becomes background noise to you in a sense. And, again, one of those role models, Steve Schneider, who was a great scientist and a great science communicator as well, and sadly passed away some years ago, but not before I had a chance to get to know him and to learn from him. And he said early on, when I was starting to find myself subject to these attacks, he said, understand, that they wouldn't be going after you if what you were saying, what you were doing wasn't important. You're hurting their client. The fossil fuel industry is who he was talking about. And they're going to come after you because you're hurting their client. Understand it's not personal. It's about the impact that you're having. And that was important to me. It allowed me to sort of view this, I suppose, philosophically, and to sort of remove myself and my own emotions from it to an extent, to see it as part of something larger. And I was able to do that because I had some good tutelage from more senior scientists. Today, I like to think that I can share those sorts of lessons, hard-learned lessons with younger scientists today who are coming up through the ranks. So it's sort of a shifting of generations now.
You talk in your book about the kind of shoot the messenger approach, which industry that wants to maintain the status quo, from tobacco to pesticides, et cetera. We've seen this over and over again, and that we're seeing it today with the attacks on, for example, Greta Thunberg.
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're still not leaving Rachel Carson alone. She's not allowed to rest in her grave. They're still going after her because of the impact, the huge impact that lives on in the legacy. And to make an example, right? If you too speak up, we're going to come after you. That's the message that they want to send to other scientists and other would-be communicators. I suppose to me, it didn't matter. I guess part of my my personality. I always hated bullies, and I would stand up to them when I was in grade school, even knowing that I'd get beaten up because it was just the right thing to do. And so I guess that prepared me well for this role that I'm playing, where I'm dealing with some pretty powerful bullies. But I'm not going to let them, get away with what they're doing. I'm going to call them out because it's the right thing to do. And I think there are enough scientists today, and I think in part because of who have grown up in the world of social media, where there's now a direct on-ramp to engagement, so it's everybody can be part of the conversation. And younger scientists today are so much more engaged and recognize that ultimately their role can go beyond doing the science and making sure that our public discourse is informed by objective science. And there's just so much more engagement on the part of young scientists today that's one of those reasons, again, that I have optimism.
I think one of the most important things to remember too is how much support the idea that we need to take action now to mitigate climate change has. I mean, you talk about it in your book, how it's the fossil fuel industry would like people to think that there's not that much support.
Right.
But in fact, certainly we've seen it in Canada in the polls,
Yep.
even in Alberta, there is strong support and recognition that climate change is happening, that it's human caused, that we need to move quickly, that we need to phase out fossil fuels. I mean, there's disagreements between, say, people who live in Quebec and people who live in Alberta, how quickly it's going to be. But
Right.
in fact, often we sit here thinking we're alone when we're attacked, but actually now that people can see the floods and the fires and the impacts, the debate is over.
No, that's right. And you see this in American politics, the polarization when it comes to sort of opinion leaders, to influencers versus where the public is. The public overwhelmingly supports common sense gun reform. And yet you can't get a single Republican in Congress to support it. And it's because the forces of inaction, the vested interests, dark money organizations, the Koch brothers, the power brokers in the conservative movement realize they no longer need the people to be with them. If they can gerrymander our Congress and elect, term after term, their preferred candidates, they can get the policies they want, even if the public isn't behind them anymore. And we see that with climate change, where I think it's something like 60% in the latest polling of Republicans under the age of 40 think we have to be doing much more about climate change. That's the Republican Party. And so there's this huge disconnect now between where the people are and where our politicians are. I think ultimately that's an unstable situation. It will change. And that's where activism and voting and organizing and all these other things come in. We have to make sure that our politics reflect where we are as a society, because if we can do that, we can tackle these problems.
Oh my gosh, we just had a flood of more questions and we only have 2 more minutes. I'm just gonna look and see if there's a couple of quick ones that we can bring in. I don't know if this is quick, but there's a clarification question. You earlier said we need to bring down our carbon emissions by a factor of 2. And there's a couple of questions online. What exactly does that mean? That went by too quickly for some people.
Sure thing. Yeah. So we've got to bring them down by roughly 7% a year for the next 10 years. And if we do that, they'll be down 50% a decade from now. 7%, here's the good news. That's what they came down by this last year. The bad news, much of that was from the response to the pandemic, social distancing, lockdowns, economic slowdown, less transportation. So what it shows is we can do that, but we're not going to get another 7% year after year by just changing our lifestyles, our behavior. What it points to is the need for a systemic solution. We really do need to decarbonize the system, and we've got to do so quickly. We've got to bring those carbon emissions down 7% a year for the next 10 years. And if we do that, we're down a factor of 2 a decade from now. And if we continue on, we're down to 0 by 2050, which is where we need to be.
Michael Mann, can you leave us with a final thought of what you think our listeners should do? You had so many great parts in the book, 4-point plan, disregard the doomsayers, child shall lead them. I'm a person listening tonight, and what should I do?
I'm going to leave it with my tagline, which is urgency and agency. There is great urgency. We have to act now. There is agency. We can do it. this is our moment. Let's do it.
Thank you so much. You are
Thank you.
such an inspiration. Your resiliency and also your courage, and courage is
Well,
contagious, and that's what
I'm
we
inspired
need.
by you too, Tzeporah. So it was a pleasure to do this with you.
I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and special thanks to the Ottawa Public Library and the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Same time next week, great follow-up conversation. Don't myth Seth Klein with his amazing book, A Good War, which will help deepen this conversation on what we need to do in Canada. Have a great evening. Stay safe. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.